topics about what I call the biotechnological revolution, which I think is going to dramatically transform all of our lives in very, very significant ways. And really the major social, political, ethical, and legal implications of this revolution. Okay, so I'll go into 8 o'clock, and afterwards, I'm very happy to answer any questions you may have. I'm sure there'll be a lot of interest in what I have to say. Okay, so if we just look at what's taken place in the last 70 years, it's really astonishing how far we've come in a very short period of time, right? Going back to the discovery of the double helix structure of DNA in 1953 at Cambridge University by Watson and Crick. And I would say very shortly after that, we see some scholars beginning to recognize that there could be very significant implications to this, right? The possibility of curing disease, the possibility of genetic engineering. One of the first articles ever written on this was by a scholar named Robert Sinsheimer at Caltech in the late 1960s. And the way he frames the biotech revolution is really fascinating. He talks about this as the chance for us to become the bright focal point of the universe once again. Wow. When he frames this in very kind of theological, metaphysical terms even. He says we've been dethroned by Copernicus, by Freud, and this is our chance to become the bright focal point of the universe once again. So this is like in the late 1960s. It's one of the first articles ever written about the biotech revolution and the kind of larger implications of this, okay? I would also say that no one really imagined just how quickly this would develop. You see this dynamic over and over again. If you're studying biotech, the technology is moving far faster than the ability of philosophers, theologians, legal scholars, legislators to really keep up. Okay, I've been involved in some attempts to develop legislation, regulation regarding biotech, and the technology is moving so quickly, right? Almost every day we're learning something new. Okay, and I'll give some examples of that as we go forward. Right, if you look at the debates about stem cell research, 20 years ago, I'm old enough to remember these. These were white hot debates 20 years ago when the President's Council on Bioethics was formed. At that time, some people who had ethical concerns about stem cell research, I think they made a mistake because they framed their concerns in kind of purely technical terms. Right, they pointed to certain things that were technically infeasible at that time, and I would say those technical challenges were solved really in a matter of months in some cases. Okay, so that's a larger lesson I want us to take from this, is that if you're going to raise ethical concerns about some forms of biotech, I would not rely upon what's technically feasible or infeasible today in 2025, because the technology is moving so quickly. I'm going to talk about CRISPR-Cas9. It came far more quickly than anybody imagined. It was announced in 2015. Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuel Charpentier won the Nobel Prize. That came probably a generation before people really thought it was possible. We're talking about the Human Genome Project as well. That was finished far more quickly than anybody imagined possible. Okay, so I'll talk about that as well. So the Human Genome Project was completed 10 to 15 years ahead of schedule. I'm old enough to remember when they did the ceremony there at the White House at the end of the Clinton administration on the Rose Lawn there. This was led by Francis Collins, one of the top geneticists in the world. He later became head of NIH. He's actually written a lot about theology and science. He's actually a very serious Christian. And this was the world's largest collaborative biological project ever. It was just an incredible, stunning feat involving pioneering work in bioinformatics and genetics. And this began in 1984. It was officially launched in 1990. It was declared complete in 2003. It's interesting, they declared it complete with only about 92% of the human genome. We continue to fill in those gaps. There's debate about whether or not we've actually filled in all those gaps. In 2023, some people are saying that we had really closed the last final sequence. Other people are skeptical about that. I would say to this day, we still do not know the precise number of protein coding genes. Okay, to the very best of our scientific knowledge, it's somewhere between 18 and 20,000. At the time of the Human Genome Project, at the time of its completion, some people thought there were as many as 100,000 genes. Okay, so that was just 25 years ago. So the number of genes keeps shrinking. Okay, the number of cells keeps growing. We're really discovering more and more cells, right? There's over at least 3 trillion cells in the body, but the number of genes keeps shrinking. And this is really important. If we're going to move ahead with what is referred to as intentional genetic modification. If we're going to seize control of this process, of the evolutionary process and what we're going to become as a species, it seems like at the very least, we're going to have to know how many genes there are. But that's going to be really important. Okay. And we don't even know that, right? So if we're going to avoid unintended consequences, disastrous, catastrophic unintended consequences, we're going to have to learn a lot more about the human genome. Okay. At the very least, how many genes there are, I'm going to talk about later on. Genes are pleiotropic as well. That means that a single gene can have multiple effects. Obviously, phenotypical expression is influenced by all sorts of contingent factors like weather and diet and trauma. And this conversation I'm having right now, this lecture is going to influence phenotypical expression, right? So it's going to be difficult to have total control of this process. Okay. So the Genome Project initially aimed to map the complete set of nucleotides contained in a human haploid reference genome, of which there are more than 3 billion. Wow. So the genome of any one of us is unique, obviously. This is really the future of medicine as well. We're clearly going in the direction of precision medicine. Right now, this is very expensive. Steve Jobs had this done as he was dying from liver cancer. In 2008, he had a full genetic profile made with $10 million. So obviously, most of us can't afford that. That cost curve will come down, right? We're seeing that more and more in oncology care, for instance. If you go to a place like MD Anderson, they're developing these very detailed genetic profiles of patients, and then their oncology treatment is being tailored to their unique genetic profile. So we're not taking a one-size-fits-all approach. And this is really the way of the future in medicine, okay? Where we're looking at your unique genetic profile. What we did with the Human Genome Project was that it was really a mosaic. It didn't represent any one individual, but it was a kind of mosaic of the human race, of human species, okay? So I want to start to talk about some of the major therapeutic uses that we're seeing here, right? So I would say we're seeing tremendous progress in terms of curing disease, alleviating suffering. And this is absolutely wonderful, right? When I give these lectures and I talk to people, I've never really met anybody who's seriously opposed to the use of biotech to cure disease. Okay, if you know anybody who's really got some kind of principled objection to this, let me know. I would love to meet them and learn about why that is, providing we can address those concerns about precautionary principle, about unintended consequences. But I think for the most part, there's a lot of openness to using biotech to cure disease, right? And we're already seeing the first wave of this now. The FDA just approved the first treatment for sickle cell anemia, right? Very painful disease that affects a significant number of people. And I want to talk about that. And there's a whole series of other treatments in the pipeline right now. Right? In the next few years, we're going to see dozens of new treatments rolled out using CRISPR-Cas9. So CRISPR-Cas9 was an absolute game changer. I would say it's one of the most important discoveries, perhaps in the history of biology. Okay, and this came way ahead of schedule. So CRISPR-Cas9 it's a very precise form of gene editing. It allows us to edit the genetic sequence in a very precise way to address some of those concerns about unintended consequences. So some examples here. In September 2020, they developed a gene therapy that showed significant improvement in motor function in patients with Parkinson's. This would be wonderful. Parkinson's is a very debilitating disease. They're also using BCI devices now to help people with Parkinson's as well, but we still have a long way to go here. Okay, so this could help alleviate some of those symptoms by increasing levels of dopamine directly in the areas where it is mostly needed. There's another treatment right now called Casgevy, developed by a company called Vertex, using CRISPR to treat people with sickle cell disease. And this is a process called ex vivo, where cells have to be collected from someone. There was just a 12-year-old boy. He was the first one to receive this treatment. And they collected cells from him. They shipped them to a manufacturing facility. They're genetically manipulated in the lab, and then they're shipped back to the hospital. So also very significantly for this, the patient has to receive chemo, and that raises all sorts of issues. Anybody who's ever undergone chemotherapy recognizes that's a very blunt instrument. It has lots of unintended consequences, right? Hair loss, nausea, exhaustion, anemia, all these things, right? So that you have to undergo chemo before the cells can be reinfused. And then that carries the risk of infertility and other issues, okay? So that's ex vivo. I want to talk about in vivo therapies now. Okay, so these hold more appeal because these are delivered directly to the patient. So there's a study going on right now. So Jennifer Doudna, who I mentioned, won the Nobel Prize in 2015. She has a great book called The Kraken Creation that I really recommend if you're interested to read this. So she is one of the co-discoverers of CRISPR-Cas9 in that final chapter in the book. She expresses some very, very serious ethical, social, and political concerns about the use of these technologies. She's one of the principal discoverers of this technique, right? So this is used to knock out a gene in the liver that might deliver a cardiac benefit. I want to see more and more of this as we go forward. And this just involves editing a specific gene in the liver. And this doesn't involve shipping cells off to a lab. It doesn't involve chemo and the risk of infertility or infection, okay? So I want to talk about some of the potential advantages here of intentional genetic modifications. I'll use that term a lot, so I'm going to use the acronym IGM. I'm going to talk a lot about IGM. So there's a number of scholars today arguing that there's actually a moral imperative to embrace IGM, that IGM would be vastly superior to unintentional genetic modification, UGM. And by that, I just simply mean kind of Darwinian natural selection operating upon random genetic mutations that provide a reproductive benefit in a selected environment. That's all I mean by UGM, that kind of Darwinian process. You learned about it in high school, maybe some of your STEM majors, right? You're very familiar with that kind of Darwinian account of natural selection, okay, UGM. So some people argue that IGM would be vastly superior. And there's actually maybe a moral imperative to embrace IGM. Not just that it's more efficient, but actually might be morally preferable. The distributed justice might require this. Okay, so I want to talk about some of the advantages that have been proposed by proponents of IGM, like Julian Sobolescu from Oxford, Alan Buchanan from Duke University, Nick Bostrom from Oxford. So these are sort of proponents of some effort for transhumanism, posthumanism. Right? I think this is really an opportunity for us to become much more than what we are. We should kind of leave behind our humanity and enter a kind of post-human era. Okay. So Darwin himself, I just taught the origin of species just last week for some students. I was again just amazed by the amount of material that Darwin was synthesizing in the origin of species. But he often pointed to examples of what he saw as faulty, irrational construction of organisms. He was trying to push back against the idea of intentional design. He wrote a famous letter to a friend of his. He said, what a book a devil's chaplain might write on the clumsy, wasteful, blundering, low, and horridly cruel works of nature. Okay, so I want to talk about some examples here that are presented by proponents of IGM. So one of the first ones they often point to is the case of suboptimal design. There's lots of examples they might point to. The urinary tract in male mammals, which passes through, rather than being routed around the prostate gland, that can obviously swell as men get older, right? You might block urinary function, can lead to infection. The primary sinus has a feeble drainage system. The inability of humans to synthesize vitamin C due to a mutation that most mammals do not have. That's led to all sorts of disease over the years. I would say that human pharynx, having that dual function, is very significant as well. So we use that both for ingestion and respiration. So what can happen, obviously, is you can choke, right? The birth canal passing through the female pelvis, that increases danger during childbirth. So they say that's due to natural selection's hasty rearrangement of the hominid posture during the evolutionary process. Some people advocated that we should radically change the morphological structure of the female body, right? And other people say, well, hey, wait a minute, I don't know if that's such a good idea. If you're going to engage in sort of wide-scale morphological engineering of the female body, you're going to engineer the pelvis, you have to engineer the spine and the hips and the neck and the knees and the ankles, and that's going to raise all sorts of, anybody's ever had a spinal surgery will say, hey, wait a minute, I don't know, right? Some people advocated that to address climate change, we should genetically engineer human beings, so that change our respiratory system so we can breathe underwater. I might say, well, just stop releasing so much carbon in the atmosphere. That might be a better, easier way to deal with this, rather than radically engineering human morphology, right? If you're going to engineer the respiratory system, you have to engineer the nervous system as well, right? All those other systems, circulatory system, and that's going to be very technically challenging. Okay, but some people think we need to do this, okay? Second example, insensitivity to the post-reproductive quality of life. So human beings are really unique in this regard, that a female will not be able to conceive a child after early 40s, but will then live on average for another 40 years or so. This seems to be a very distinctly human phenomenon. And so some people say, well, over time, human beings, organisms are allowed to drift, ontogenetically speaking. So you have all those mutations that start to accumulate in your cell lines that can lead to all sorts of diseases like cancer, cardiovascular issues, neural degeneration. And it seems like Darwinian natural selection doesn't put much value on the physiological repair of post-reproductive traits, and that leads to disease and eventually death. Right? If you ask a gerontologist, evolutionary biologist about why we die, they would start to talk about this, right? This ontological drift that's taking place. Also, in 1953, there was a very important discovery by Leonard Hayflick at MIT. He discovered what's called the Hayflick limit. This idea there's a limit to the number of times that a cell can divide. Okay, and this is true of all human cells except cancer cells, viruses, and stem cells. And that's one reason why there's so much interest in stem cells. Okay, is that they are not really immortal, called immortal, but they keep dividing indefinitely. Okay, so I'll talk more about the idea of radical life extension later on. There's a lot of money being poured into this right now. If you go to Silicon Valley, there's billions of dollars being invested in radical life extension technology to prevent those cell lines from shrinking, right? So creating an artificial enzyme called telomerase that would try to slow down the aging process. And that raises all sorts of profound philosophical questions about whether or not, is it good that we die? Is mortality a gift and a blessing? Or is death a disease? Should we treat death as a disease? That's a really profound philosophical question, right? If immortality becomes a possibility, we're able to really slow down the aging process or stop the aging process. George Church, one of the co-discoverers of CRISPR-Cas9, is talking a pretty big game now. He really thinks that we're on the verge of really gaining greater and greater control over the aging process. And the really fascinating philosophical question is whether or not we should, if that becomes technically possible. You could really slow down that process or stop that process. Right? Those are really philosophical questions, I would say. Those are not technical questions. Okay. So yeah, this is another reason that's given. Let's look at the third reason. So you made a population bottlenecks in the evolutionary process, mass extinction events. We all know about the dinosaurs 60 million years ago, founder effects, and those can impose very highly circumscribed limits on that can constrain the process of natural selection. And so some people say natural selection operates more like a bricklayer than a master engineer, that is just responding to immediate need. It's not planning ahead. It's co-opting existing structures in this very ad hoc way to meet functional demands. IGM might be vastly superior here because why we can plan ahead. Okay. Number 4, evolutionary hangovers. You talk to evolutionary psychologists, they'll say a lot of mental health issues, psychological disorders, depression, anxiety, attention deficit disorder might come from difficulties associated with our transition from hunter-gatherer species to one that's lives a very sedentary, monotonous indoor existence. We spend a lot of time in cubicles and in front of screens. Okay, so they might say there's these Pleiadian hangovers, right? Our love for sweet and fatty food, right? We all love that. Stepchild abuse, xenophobic aggression. There may be very kind of deep evolutionary roots to some very troubling behaviors, right? They're really morally troubling. Okay. Number 5, the origination and fixation mutations. They might argue that those beneficial mutations might take thousands or millions of years to reach a population level effect. Take a very long time, right? How are genes normally passed on through sexual reproduction vertically? Well, IGM would really allow for us to speed that process up rather than waiting millions and millions of years for a beneficial mutation to work its way through the human race. We could really speed this up, or we could just start inserting genes into embryos in the context of IVF. Okay, this might be much more reliable, much faster. It would have much less human carnage, right? We might be able to really save a lot of lives here. Okay, they would say it actually counts morally in its favor, not just a matter of efficiency. Okay, also it could safeguard valuable genotypes, right? The same way human beings cradled fire early on. And this might be very important as a source of survival for current and future generations. Let's look at number 6. Okay, so some people say, natural selection operates in this very blind, incremental way. You've got all these awkward, transitional, crippled life forms. Okay, and it's had these very severe constraints in how quickly they can accomplish a certain adaptive feat, but also even what feats can be accomplished at all. Right, there's a lot of debate in evolutionary theory here about whether or not there are just certain feats that natural selection could never achieve, even given large populations in very vast amounts of time, kind of deep time. Okay, so some people point to this idea of what's called linkage disequilibrium. So you have, this is actually pretty ubiquitous, where you have fitness enhancing genes are located in the chromosome close to those neutral or even maladaptive genes. And then you have those maladaptive genes being passed on to the next generation, despite their detrimental effect on the phenotype. So the idea is IgM would be superior here. Okay, much more precise. Talk about number 7. I think this is probably one of the strongest arguments on behalf of IgM. It's lateral gene transfer. We just lived through the COVID pandemic, right? I think it was really difficult for all of us. It could have been a lot worse than it was. There's probably people out there that have a random genetic mutation that gives them a boosted immunity to COVID, right? And so why wait for that to, in some cases, millions and millions of years for that to reach populational effect, when we could, right, through IgM, we could actually pass that gene laterally, not vertically through sexual reproduction, but laterally. Also, we could take genes from other species, and even genes that are artificially created through synthetic biology. There's a lot of work being done right now in synthetic biology about creating artificial embryos. That raises all sorts of difficult questions. I'm going to talk IVG later on, in vitro gametogenesis, right? Not just IVF, but actually creating gametes, creating sperm and eggs in a lab. That's going to raise all sorts of profound social, political, ethical, and legal questions as well. Okay. Number 8, species extinction. I would say we're seeing unprecedented species extinction right now. We've just never seen it before. Okay, this is very alarming, but we've seen this in the past as well. Obviously, we're familiar with cases of species extinction. You might go, go to the museum and see, the dinosaur fossils, right? Right now, they're building a massive human gene bank and a global seed vault as well that could be maintained in case of an extinction event. So that might be able to stave off any reverse natural extinction events. Okay, so George Church is all in favor of bringing back woolly mammoths. He's got a giant picture of a woolly mammoth in his office. He thinks this is wonderful, right? Natural selection can't do this. Natural selection cannot bring back an extinct species. Okay, but we could. Whether or not we should is a different question. Number 9, optimization of one trait is not improvement overall. So a good example here of bipedalism. Yes, bipedalism. There were significant fitness benefits to bipedalism, but there also were substantial costs associated with bipedalism as well. And so the reconstruction of the hominid skeleton, some people think this led to higher rates of neonatal and maternal birth mortality, susceptibility to joint problems, back problems, and so on. Okay, but obviously much better than knuckle walking. But there's side effects, right? There's trade-offs even with optimization of one trait. Number 10, the inability of UGM to break out of stable local optima. Okay, so again, UGM might get kind of trapped on a lower peak, but IgM might be able to kind of have a better view of the adaptive landscape and plan ahead and kind of make leaps, right, to these higher sort of fitness peaks, so to speak. Okay, then we might have a much higher view. Think about mountain climbing. You climb Mount Helena, right? A better view here. You can see further, right? So this could be another advantage here as well. Okay. Number 11, optimality is context dependent. So the more expansive your view of the adaptive landscape, the better we'll be at identifying the highest peaks. Okay, and it's only through IgM that we might really get there. UGM is going to be too slow. There's too much waste. There's too much suffering. This is the argument, at least. And concern, the idea is it's vastly superior for those 11 reasons. Okay, so now I want to talk about some of the concerns that have been raised. I think there's a lot of legitimate concerns here that have been raised. Okay, by scholars Leon Cass, who's a teacher of mine at the University of Chicago, later became chairman of the President's Council on Bioethics, by Michael Sandel, who's a professor at Harvard, Francis Fukuyama, who's a scholar at Stanford University, many others, right? So there's been intense debate about this. I want to talk about some of the central concerns that have been raised against various forms of biotech and IgM especially, okay? So a lot of people say, yeah, genetic technology is part of this larger humanitarian project to cure disease and to alleviate suffering. Yes, that's wonderful. That's absolutely wonderful. Okay, we can't lose sight of that. Right? I give all these lectures, and I've had parents come up to me afterwards, mothers with tears in their eyes, saying, my child has this rare genetic disease, and the doctors feel like they're helpless to do anything about it, and this feels like our only hope. And maybe there's some type of genetic engineering here, intervention, that could save his life or cure this disease. Okay, so yes, crucial to hold on to that. So I think, yes, there's tremendous value here. Who would not welcome genetic therapy to correct the defects of sickle cell anemia, Huntington's disease, cancer, of course, right? I think we all know somebody with cancer at some point. Protect against HIV, this actually happened in China. There's a scholar named Li Jiankui, you might have heard about this. So he genetically engineered 2 twins there. He gave them a boosted immunity to HIV. Sounds pretty good, right? Well, as we're going to talk about, that there may be unintended, even catastrophic consequences of it. So those twins are going to be watched very, very carefully as their reproductive decisions will be watched very carefully as well. You kind of trace their lineage, right, to study their genetic profile. So he actually was arrested in China. He was put in prison by the Chinese Communist Party, not because I think they have any principled objection to genetic engineering, but simply because he acted in an unauthorized way. He kind of went off the reservation. He acted on his own. So he was in prison for a while. He just got out of prison, and they put him in charge of a giant genetics institute in China. So he's probably going to start engineering a lot more people, okay? And it's probably going to be framed initially in terms of choosing against or selecting against catastrophic illnesses. Like, what parent is, wants to have a child with genetic predisposition to Huntington's or Tay-Sachs disease or trisomy 13? Right, of course, right? Parents are going to say, I want to protect my children. Right, so there's a technology called PGD, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. It's being used a lot in the IVF process. Synthetic embryos are coming, embryo factories are coming. We're going to produce lots and lots of embryos. And PGD allows us to scan those embryos very quickly and to identify genetic errors or dysgenic traits. And I think initially this is going to be deployed to choose or select against traits like ALS, right? Stephen Hawking, if he had been tested as a 21-day-old embryo in the early 1950s, they would have seen he had a genetic predisposition to ALS. He probably would not have lived. He probably would have been discarded or killed, right? But could they have predicted he would go on to hold the chair in mathematical physics at Cambridge that Isaac Newton once held and go on to do all this pioneering, extraordinary work on black holes? Could we predict that by looking at him as a 21-day embryo? What can we really tell about any of you? If we wound the clock back and looked at you as an embryo, how much can we really tell about you, who you are? What really defines you, right? Okay. So I think this is initially how it's going to unfold here, right? So what I often see is, when people hear about biotech, I see this in my teaching, a lot of people feel a real sense of unease. Michael Sandel calls this moral vertigo. There's a sense that there's something unique about biotech. That yes, in some sense, it is continuous with the traditional project of medicine, the Hippocratic project of curing disease. There's also a recognition on some level, there's something unique here as well. There's something that's discontinuous. And it causes this sense of vertigo, unease, disquiet that people struggle to articulate. And they reach for certain euphemisms. They talk about there's something unnatural here. We're tampering human genes. Playing God is a really common expression here. You're seeing some divine prerogative. There's something off here, right? So I think it's important we move beyond just that intuition or that hunch, and that feeling to really try to articulate the principles underlying those feelings, those concerns, right? That disquiet. Okay, so I think a lot of enthusiasts, right? They might say, oh, you're just a Luddite. You're expressing concerns about this. You're just getting in the way. All these ethical concerns, don't worry about it. We're just full speed ahead. We'll deal with the problems as they come up. This is called the technological imperative. Just full speed ahead, and we'll deal with whatever problems come up, okay? You're just getting in the way of obstructing scientific progress. I think it's completely, I don't think that's a really helpful way to think about this debate at all. I think the average person has legitimate reasons to be concerned. I think there are very real, very serious, legitimate social, political, and ethical concerns here about the biotech revolution that we're going to talk about, okay? So I would say it actually threatens the deepest matters of our humanity, our dignity, okay? So what are some of the technical challenges here that have been raised? Again, I wouldn't just focus on technical challenges, but there are real technical challenges here, right? So one, discovering a DNA sequence is far easier than learning how it's going to interact with the living body. So there's real concerns here about using human beings in research. We're doing a lot of animal testing right now. So that even raises ethical concerns as well. For those of us who are animal lovers, right, we might raise serious concerns there even about, creating or infecting an animal with an extremely debilitating disease to study its progression, but this is very common in biomedical research right now. Synthesizing a healthy gene to replace a defective one is much easier than delivering it safely to the right places in the body. And having it work only as desired without those unintended consequences. This is the major challenge, is to avoid those unintended consequences. Because again, we don't even know how many genes there are, right? Okay, as I mentioned, genes are pleiotropic. So a single gene might have multiple effects. Also, recessive genes may not show up for several generations. So we have to do very serious long-term longitudinal studies as well. Okay, to make sure that there are not really serious unintended consequences here. I think the best analogy we have is with an ecosystem. What's true of every single ecosystem? You might go to a place like Yellowstone. You can't change one part without influencing every other part. Okay, so this is going to be very significant. You influence, just change one gene, one single genetic error. One single wrong allele can cause a catastrophic illness, like cystic fibrosis or sickle cell anemia. It's caused by a single wrong allele, single coding error. Right? Also, practical and financial obstacles here as well. Right? I mean, the sickle cell anemia treatment this young boy just received costs between $2.2 and $3 million. So insurance companies are going to push back against this. I mean, many people in America, we have the best healthcare in the world. We spend more money, we spend over $4 trillion a year in healthcare. There's some parts of the world that don't have any healthcare at all. And yet here, even in the US, a lot of people don't even have access to basic healthcare, let alone cutting edge genetic technology. Raise concerns about distributed justice. It's called the Gen Rich scenario. We're going to talk about later on that initially these technologies may be available only to the very wealthy or people who are socially and politically connected. And they may go to great lengths to ensure that they alone have access to these technologies because of the competitive advantages they provide. Okay, so that's another major concern that comes up here, the Gen Rich scenario. Okay, and there's debate now, is access to these technologies a human right? To genetically engineer yourself, to engineer your children? I would not be surprised if we start to go in that direction. Some people start saying, I have a human right to engineer myself and my children. How dare you interfere with this? When we think about eugenics in the past, we think about the Nazis, we think about people we drag kicking and screaming, euthanized or sterilized against their will. It's not hard to imagine a scenario in the near future where people are storming research labs and hospitals and demanding access to these technologies. So this is a human right. Right? If we see especially the Gen Rich scenario, Elon Musk announced, tomorrow he's engineered himself and his 11 kids. Right? The rest of us might say, hey, wait a minute. Right, we see a kind of bottom-up, kind of democratic. Fukuyama has argued this is going to become the most important social and political issue of the 21st century, that who has access to these technologies. Other people like Michael Sandel will say, yes, that's an important question, but there's an even deeper question, which is whether or not anybody should be genetic engineering themselves or their children. It's not just a question of access and justice. Should anybody be doing this? The wealthy, right, and so on. Okay, does that fundamentally distort the parent-child relationship? Michael Sandel has argued that it would fundamentally disfigure and distort the parent-child relationship. That we choose our friends, we even choose our spouses, but we do not choose our children. He thinks this is very significant. That we offer our children unconditional love. He thinks this is the norm that should govern the practice of virtuous parenting. And that genetically engineering your children would endanger that or distort that or disfigure that relationship. Okay? That's a famous argument of his in a book called The Case Against Perfection. It's a very thought-provoking title, The Case Against Perfection. Okay. Moral concerns. I really want to focus on the moral concerns here. I think it's a mistake just to focus on the practical concerns, the cost, the financial concerns. And at first glance, you might say, well, it's not that different, right? People made these arguments. You might say isolating a disease-inducing aberrant gene looks fairly continuous with what we're doing now, isolating intracellular virus. Is there really a meaningful moral difference here? Supplying diabetics normal genes for producing insulin has the same medical goal, supplying them insulin for injection, right? So some people might say, well, there's really no moral difference here at all. I would push back here. I would say no. There's really two major differences here. There's two powers possessed by biotech, which are discontinuous with traditional medicine, going all the way back to Hippocrates and Galen. Okay, I would say traditional medicine treats only existing individuals. Okay, it treats them remedially, seeks to restore you to health. What's the telos of medicine? What's the purpose of medicine? It's to cure disease. It's to restore you to health. Okay, trying to correct deviations from what is a more or less stable norm of health. Define health as sort of the body's intrinsic capacity for integrated functioning, something like that. Okay. I would say in contrast, genetic engineering will deliberately make changes that are transmissible into succeeding generations. So these will be inheritable characteristics that are passed on. Okay, that's a major difference. Okay, think about Li Jiankui here. with germline engineering. When you engineer those germ cells, which mature into sperm and eggs, those changes will be passed on to your children, your grandchildren. Okay. Number two, I would say that we're going to start to see shifting norms of health and disease. Okay, we're also going to start to go in the direction of what's called enhancement. This is a really important distinction here between therapy and enhancement. So enhancement, you're seeking to go above or beyond some species typical level. Okay, you might have, you know, 20/20 vision to be really healthy vision. You might try to go to 20/10, something like that. A 120 IQ is considered average for a college graduate. 160 is considered genius level. 80 is considered, if you have an 80 IQ, that triggers all sorts of legal implications. Can't serve in the military, you qualify for disability and so on. Okay. Some people argue we should just use to lift up people who are at 80 up to 120. We should stop there. Other people are very skeptical and say, we're not going to stop there. Are you kidding me? Those of us who are 120 are so I want to go up to 160. If everybody goes up to 160, then you're just average. You're gonna have to go up to 180 or 200. So you have the genetic arms race here. That makes sense? Okay. I think also, if you look at all the different examples here, perfect pitch is a great example. We found the gene that causes perfect pitch. This is amazing. The single genetic mutation responsible for perfect pitch. Right? You think about Mozart, right? Paul McCartney, wonderful. We see this as a miraculous gift. It's not hard to imagine a scenario in the near future, maybe a generation now, when all of us have perfect pitch. And how are we going to view that person who does not have perfect pitch? Probably as disabled. We say they have a disability. So our very conception of health and disease is going to shift. Okay, if you wear glasses in the future, you have myopia, right? You might start to say, well, there's something really wrong here, right? You're disabled, right? You have asthma, something like that. Okay. Yeah, I think there's all examples as well. I mean, there's one example of technologies that appear to be totally therapeutic, totally altruistic, like treating muscle loss, memory loss. It just immediately went in the direction of enhancement. I mean, just immediately to these beyond therapy uses, right? So Olympic athletes are using them now, like drugs that were used to treat people with muscular dystrophy, muscle loss. Yes, that's wonderful. We want to cure MS, sure. But who else is interested in this? The rest of us who do not have that disease, right? Olympic athletes, right? Who see real competitive advantage there and using those drugs. Lance Armstrong, all the drugs he was taking, right? Very tragic case because he wanted that competitive advantage. Okay, memory loss to treat dementia. Yes, absolutely, wonderful. But maybe the rest of us might be interested in memory enhancement. Okay. So also, I think there's this real concern that we're increasingly losing control of this process. The genetic gening is getting out of the bottle. There's a lot of debate about this today. We lost agency here. We lost control of this process. And there's debate about, did we ever really have control? Or maybe when did we lose that control? Was it the 1950s? Was it the 1970s when we were doing all that recombinant DNA research? Was it 2000 when we finished the Human Genome Project? Was it 2015 with CRISPR-Cas9? But some scholars have argued we've lost control of this process. And the best we can really hope for is to kind of brace for impact. That this genetic revolution, biotech revolution, has taken on a life of its own. It's going to be very, very difficult to stop. It's not really clear who could stop this process, or even if we should, because of the great benefits that it offers, okay? I think it's very likely we're going to see germline gene therapy in the near future. I think it's going to be very difficult to stop. We can talk about this after in the question and answer. So what are some of the potential justifications? People have said, well, why should we allow these dysgenic genes to persist in the genetic pool? Somebody has a genetic error that causes diabetes. Why should we allow them to live long enough to transmit their disease-producing genes? Why not address that now? Right? Okay. Why not reverse those through deliberate interventions? Okay. Why not engineer those disease-carrying sperm and eggs? Because later on, it's going to be very expensive to treat. We spend trillions of dollars in healthcare. This might be a type of preventative medicine, these early genetic interventions. Okay. So I think it's unlikely we're going to be able to hold that. So somatic cell engineering is much more difficult technically. You have to engineer a greater number of cells, and you don't have those inherited characteristics being passed on. So some people have said we've got to draw the line here between somatic cell engineering and germline engineering. I think it's going to be very difficult to draw that line, okay? Let's talk about some of the other questions here. I mean, are we going to deny prospective parents the right to enhance the potential of their children? Especially when other people are doing it. Say all your friends and neighbors, say you're struggling in the workplace, your kids are struggling in school to keep up with those who have gone down this path, genetic engineering for the sake of enhancement. Do you really have much choice at that point? If China starts to genetically engineer their citizens, pretty much of a choice here in the US. Right, somebody like Fukuyama's argued that if we're gonna address this, we're gonna have to be like global agreements. He actually said the best analogy we have are these universal global arms treaties for nuclear weapons. He says that's the level of regulation we're gonna need over biotech. That's the best analogy we have is the regulation. You can't go online and buy like enriched plutonium. There's like good reasons for that, right? But you can go on, eBay and buy gene editing kits. It's really easy. You know, so I think it's likely we're going to see a black market here. It's very difficult to stop because of the benefits here. We likely will see a black market. We may see people go to great lengths to gain access to these technologies. Okay. Should we discover the genetic switches that control our biological clock? Are we going to keep our hands off the rate of aging? When you use PGD, right, you're initially going to probably select against catastrophic illnesses. It's going to be so easy just to move that mouse an extra inch and start choosing 4 positive characteristics, like a boosted immune system. Okay, or increased athleticism, intelligence, IQ. We're going to talk about, there's companies right now advertising to very wealthy families saying, look, we've identified genetic markers for boosted IQ. And people are paying hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions of dollars on the IVF process to try to identify and choose embryos. With, you know, extra 5 IQ points, 10 IQ points, I think they're kind of being misled as well. I think some of these companies are not being totally honest about the level of certainty that they're able to achieve, but people are willing to do this. I think we're going to see this dynamic unfold. Okay. Well, some people start to see enhancement as human right. You might start seeing this framed in rights discourse. This is a fundamental human right. Okay, so I would say there's a real paradox here. I would say the paradox is that the more our power grows, the less power we have to control this process. Okay, and that's a really important paradox to think about. I would say the biotech revolution started as a celebration of autonomy, of self-creation, of self-fashioning, but in the end, it may end up robbing all of us of agency. And maybe we need a better understanding of freedom. If your conception of freedom leads to the total loss of all agency, maybe we need a better conception. Okay, so I think this is an important paradox for us to think about, that we're increasingly powerless to establish any clear limits to the use of these technologies. As our power grows, we're increasingly powerless. Does that make sense? Okay. I'd also say genetic discrimination is another very real concern. Legal scholars are way behind you. I'm friends with a scholar, Glenn Cohen, teaches at Harvard Law School. He's one of the few people really working on this. We're in the near future. You know, you can go on like the dark web and people are willing to spend more money on your medical records than they are on your bank records. You can buy some of these medical records on the dark web. Okay, so you might apply for a mortgage and they might say, well, sorry, we're not giving you a mortgage based on your genetic profile. Your employer might insist on genetic testing in order to hire you for a job, right? It might be very difficult to get health insurance, life insurance based on your genetic profile. There's a great movie called Gattaca. I highly recommend it, right? Ethan Hawke plays this guy. He's a godchild. He was naturally conceived. He was not genetically engineered. And his dream is to become an astronaut. And he goes to apply at NASA and they take a single drop of blood. And it comes back and he's a defective. That's the title they use. He says, what about the interview? And he said, that was the interview. We know everything you need to know about you. The single drop of blood, single hair follicle. Okay, so I think there's a lot of legislative work here that needs to be done to address genetic discrimination. I think it's going to be a major issue as we go forward. As we gain more and more genetic, if you have 23andMe, anybody use 23andMe? I would delete your data right away. They just went bankrupt, okay? Because that information is going to be floating around, okay? And that's really sensitive information, right? You know, we understand the importance of HIPAA. I think we understand we don't want our medical information floating around. Okay, so if you've used any of those services, I would just be aware of that. Okay, make sure that that is safe and secure. Okay, it's not clear what's going to happen to that information if 23andMe they just declare bankruptcy. Okay, so I think another concern here is how it might distort our self-understanding. I think a lot of people are going to struggle to interpret a lot of this genetic information. I think clinical genomics counselors will be very important here. You might take a genetic test. You might struggle to live well with that knowledge, that sort of uncertain knowledge. Okay, so let's think about, would you welcome knowledge that you carry a predisposition to Alzheimer's disease, schizophrenia, or some other personality or behavior disorder that will definitely produce, at an unknown future time, a serious but untreatable disease? Would you want to know that? I think a lot of us probably say no. We might at least express concern about that. You might say, well, it might deform my life. I might just live in constant fear. I might be consumed by anxiety. And I'm just gonna live my life. We'll see what happens. Okay. So I think we're gonna really struggle to live well with uncertain knowledge. I was reading about a case where a father insisted his daughter have an overectomy and mastectomy because she carried the BRCA1 gene. It's a pretty brutal, invasive medical procedure. I think it's a good example of somebody struggling to live well with uncertain genetic knowledge. Okay, you might make really poor decisions. Okay. Some people don't realize Prometheus obviously gave us fire, but what was even the greater gift that Prometheus gave us? For Aeschylus was the gift of blind hopes. Do not have the future always. Think about, would you want to know exactly how your life's going to turn out? Would you want to know exactly when and how you're going to die? A lot of us probably say no. I think there's real concerns about eugenics here as well. I'm very concerned we're going to see a kind of resurgence of eugenics in the 21st century. Social Darwinism, I think we're all kind of familiar with that. 19th century is extremely toxic brew of racism and xenophobia and kind of ableism and all these things, bad science, junk science, all kind of mixed together. Okay. But I think we may see, there's a lot of people defending now what's called liberal eugenics. Right? Norm Daniels from Harvard, Dan Wickler from Harvard, Alan Buchanan, they wrote an entire book called From Chance to Choice, defending liberal eugenics, the kind of genetic supermarket where you're free to go into, like imagine going to Home Depot, you're gonna remodel your kitchen, all those different colors there. Well, in the future, instead of hiring a wedding planner, you're probably gonna hire a child planner. And you're gonna go in there and you're gonna choose all the genetic and somatic features of your children, or at least have that choice. And that's what they wanna celebrate, is that choice. And people should have that choice. But obviously, you might feel all sorts of pressure there. I don't think any of these decisions are going to be made in a kind of coercion can take very subtle forms. People are not going to be drag kicking and screaming, but coercion can take very subtle forms. Okay. I think people might face very strong pressure to go down this route, right? Social pressure from your employer. Your employer might put pressure on you. The federal government might start to put pressure on people. We saw this during the COVID pandemic. There were kind of very soft forms of pressure. Maybe you lose your job. Or maybe your kids can't enroll in school or something like that. Okay. I think also this is a great phrase that Dr. Cass, my teacher, used to use, the benevolent tyranny of expertise, the framing effect. It's so easy to kind of get people to choose a certain path. We're not experts. We're not geneticists. Right, just in the way you frame the topic, what information you give, how you give it, when you give it, you can very subtly frame people's choices, their decisions, okay? There are real concerns here about coercion, the various forms this could take. Interesting question, is there a right not to know? Right, in Europe, they passed a law where you're required, right? There's 72 different diseases you test positive, they have to tell you. You can't opt out. Is there a right not to know? Your genetic predispositions, right, for various reasons, okay? I think we're seeing we're going to see more and more screening, I would say. Some people think that we're going to increasingly go in the direction of just artificial reproduction, that natural reproduction may become increasingly rare. Glenn Cohen from Harvard, I mentioned, he thinks that the next generation, natural reproduction is going to become very rare, increasingly rare. Okay, and there's legitimate concerns about that. You might say, well, there's a lot of value in natural reproduction and pregnancy and so on, right? Artificial wombs are coming, right? It's going to have a profound impact on the abortion debate. I would say the next 10 years, we're seeing right now artificial wombs being deployed to try to save very, very premature children who otherwise would die, okay? Also, the playing God objection, I would say the real heart of the playing God objection is really a concern about eugenics. It's some human being sitting in judgment of other human beings and saying, this person has no right to life, based not on moral criteria, but on genetic and somatic criteria. Right? He said this person should have no legal and moral protections because they are imperfect. They might have some very minor imperfection. Okay, so that's really the heart of the playing God objection. And that's probably a pretty good definition of eugenics as well. Some human beings sitting in judgment of others and their right to life based on genetic and somatic criteria. Okay, because they're not biologically flawless or perfect. And that's really all of us. Are any of us have optimal biological health? No. Okay. So I think we're going to see more and more of this, right? The screening process, more and more embryos being discarded, more and more embryos being produced. There are legitimate concerns here. There's right now about 1.4 million snowflake embryos. That number is going to grow dramatically. And this leads into the concerns about human commodification, the increasing commodification of human life. We start to see children as consumer goods, as a product, as a thing, as an object, right? Where all of us might be increasingly dehumanized by this process. Okay. I mentioned in vitro gametogenesis. This is going to allow for the creation of eggs and sperm artificially. Asexual reproduction is coming as well. This can be technically possible here. Relatively soon, a woman can take an adult stem cell or adult somatic cell from her arm, be reprogrammed, be a sperm cell used to impregnate one of her eggs, right? So again, there's real questions here about what is technically possible and what is ethical. Should we, just simply do whatever is ethically or technically possible? Some people have said we're on the path to designer babies, the kind of designer baby catalog. This is the path that we're on, and it may be very difficult to stop. Maybe some of us try to opt out of this. Maybe we try to be a kind of witness against this in some way, but it may be difficult. Okay. I think economic interests are going to be very strong here as well, pushing us forward. Right? Mark, your employer might push you in this direction, the government might push you in this direction. Concerns about the manufacture of human life, right? I don't think any of us, we don't talk about breeding human beings, we don't talk about manufacturing human beings. We recognize how dehumanizing that language is, right? And real concerns about distributed justice. I think this is a really important concern, as I mentioned earlier, the Gen Rich scenario. I mentioned that company, Heliospec Genomics. The Guardian they went undercover and they captured the video footage, and they're requesting $50,000 to seek to test 100 embryos, and they're claiming that they can produce a gain of more than 6 IQ points. Wow. We're going to see more and more of this. Okay, people seeking shortcuts. People are buying eggs now. There's a famous case at Harvard. A couple put an ad in the Harvard Crimson offering $50,000 for a premium egg with very specific conditions. That she had to be 5'10", very tall for a female, way above species typical. Had to be a Division I college athlete. So less than 1% of all high school athletes will play Division I college sports. Had to have over 1,500 in the SATs. No major history of illness in the family. Okay, so a lot of people are very willing to kind of rig the system, so to speak, to get a premium egg. Okay, maybe try to buy some Elon Musk sperm or something like that, right? And you'll see more and more, okay? Okay, he's just giving it away, people, right? Okay. Because people want, they're looking for kind of advantage here, right? Okay. So let's think about this. I mean, what is going to be the standard? When you abandon health as the standard, traditionally health has been the standard of medicine. So all the way back to Hippocrates. What happens when you abandon health? I think we're adrift on open seas at this point, okay? What does healthy and normal mean at that point? Okay. Memory is good, but how much more do you want to remember everything that happened? Do you want total recall? That's an interesting question. We're going to gain more and more control over our memory. Also, memory suppression. Go to Walter Reed Hospital in DC right now. They're trying to treat soldiers coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan with severe PTSD. They're developing drugs like propanol, for instance, which can prevent short-term memory formation. Should we give these to soldiers before they go into combat? Should we give this to firefighters in 9/11? Should we give this to a victim of a violent crime? Should the police carry these drugs with them? Give them an injection of propanol. Is there a duty to remember? Even if you're like a survivor of Auschwitz, do you have a duty to bear witness to what happened there, terrific as it is? These are really fascinating questions. So yes, memory is good. How much we got it? Life is good, but how much of the extension of the lifespan should we seek? Okay. Should we pursue the elimination of all disease, all pain, all suffering, even death itself? Is death a disease? That's a really fascinating philosophical question. Okay. Some people have said, Dr. Cass, my teacher, says the real goal here is the creation of a painless, suffering-free, and finally immortal existence. If you read a lot of really early modern philosophers like Bacon and Descartes, you might be familiar with them. I would say a lot of biotech is coming out of early modern philosophy and this project of mastery, of dominion, of control. Descartes, in the Discourse on Methods, talked about creating bodies as indestructible as diamonds. Bacon in the 16th century is talking about creating immortal bodies. Wow. Okay, is this a goal that we should pursue? I would say we're still amoral, and that's significant. So even if we could slow down the aging process, it would still be amoral. So you could still be murdered, you could, be hit by an asteroid, you could be poisoned. Some people have said we would be the amoral people would be more risk averse than anyone else. To be terrified to even cross the street, let alone try to climb Mount Everest. Interesting question here. Will we continue to engage in the activities that make life worth living if we stop dying? That's a really interesting philosophical question. Okay. So let's talk about some precautionary heuristics here. Now I'll wrap up with this. So there have been some proposals made about the principles, the heuristics should guide this process. And I want to think about whether or not these are sufficient. So the first one is that we should just target genes at those shallower ontogenetic depths, those that lie downstream. Those are less likely to have those cascading negative consequences. Secondly, some people said we should just try to lift up people to a species typical level, not try to go in the direction of enhancement, boost those people from 80 IQ up to 120. Are you going to be satisfied with that? Probably not. If you have a choice of 1,000 embryos, you're going to choose the one that's most species typical, the most average one. Which one are you going to choose? The best one. And that's the question. What is the best one? Okay. Okay. Number 3, they should be containable to a particular organism. They don't spread. Okay. Try to avoid unintended consequences that would preclude germline engineering. Also should be containable within a system. That's going to be difficult if you're going to engineer the immune system. Engineer the nervous system. That's going to be difficult to contain, right? Respiratory system. Number 5, the effects should have to be reversible. That would also preclude germline engineering. Number 6, it would not require major morphological changes like re-engineering the female pelvis. Okay. Number 7, the causal functions or the causal role should be understood. There's an important question about what does that mean to be well understood? How much do we have to know before we move forward? Daniel Allen from Harvard has argued that the greater the harms, the higher level of certainty that's required. So if you're facing catastrophic harms, that's going to require a very high level of certainty to justify moving forward. Okay, if the harms are much lesser, then you don't need that same high level of certainty here. Okay, but I think sickle cell anemia and malaria is a great example here, right? So we know now that if you that wrong allele for sickle cell anemia also gives you boosted immunity to malaria. So that may not be a big deal in Montana, but in India, that's a big deal. When I went to India, I was taking anti-malarial medication all the time. Malaria is very, it has lifelong effects. So we might have very, very good intentions in curing sickle cell anemia, but we might create something far worse. Okay, that's a legitimate concern, I would say. So questions I want us to think about and wrap up with this, right? Can we think of better cautionary heuristics or principles that should guide this process? Should we even embrace the project of intentional genetic modification? Is it really technically superior? Is it morally superior? Is there a moral imperative to embrace this? Should we seize this awe-inspiring godlike power over the evolutionary process that we now have? We've never had this before. Okay, the question is, how do we use this power? If you read Plato's Republic, I highly recommend. It's really about power, right? It's one of the major themes in there. How can human beings exercise power without being destroyed by it, without being disfigured by it? That's a really important question. Is there a moral imperative? Can this process be stopped? Should it be stopped? Okay, where are we headed? That's a question I really want to say. Where are we headed? Right, as humanity, where is humanity headed in the aftermath of the biotech revolution? I think it's crucial we avoid any type of fatalism, and we do everything we can to guide and direct this process in the most humane and just and fair way possible. It's going to be difficult. That's what we're going to have to try. Okay. We can't lose sight of the tremendous therapeutic benefits to cure disease, but also I would say there are very legitimate concerns here as well. And we're going to have to find that middle way, that third way. And it's going to be difficult, but we have to try. Okay. I think the stakes here could not be higher. Okay. So I hope this is helpful. Happy to take any questions anybody may have. And thank you, everybody.
People like in the legal industry working right now to like say develop laws in America to protect people from genetic discrimination or anything like that?
Yeah, I would say more in Europe, Latin America, in Venezuela, Chile. There were attempts to ban cloning in the US. There was an attempt to pass a federal ban. They couldn't get the votes in the Senate, especially. You're starting to see some progress in state legislatures to address genetic discrimination, but I would say we're way behind the curve. There's a lot that needs to be done. A lot of people are just not even aware of this. A lot, your average state legislator here, you know, in the Montana state legislature is probably not even aware of this at all. It's just not on their radar. And it needs to be. Right. So I would say, yeah, legal scholars are struggling to keep up. You know, is there a right not to be cloned? That's a really interesting question, right? So there was a guy in Italy who was obsessed with Sophia Loren. He was trying to clone her, trying to steal her genetic material. Is there a right not to be cloned, right? So you throw that Starbucks coffee in the trash, somebody fishes it out of the garbage and they get your genetic material. Can they clone you? Or do you own your genetic profile? That's a really interesting legal question, right? You know, can you be discriminated? Can you be denied a mortgage? Can you be deployed, denied a promotion at work? Can you be denied health insurance or life insurance, right? So it's really important that legislators and legal scholars catch up very, very fast. It needs to happen. Yeah.
Where should we be like keeping up with like developments in this field, and then what other books do you recommend reading? You mentioned 3.
Yeah, good question. Yeah. Wall Street Journal has been running a whole series of articles on biotech. There's journalist Amy Doxter Marcus. I know her. We were in the same program together at Harvard. And she does really serious high-level science journalism, I would say. Check out the Wall Street Journal. They've had a whole series of articles on this. So very well-written articles that explain CRISPR-Cas9 technology. Some of the had an article about that boy that underwent the treatment for sickle cell anemia. So yeah, I would check out their journalism. This is starting to break into public consciousness, I would say. I've been talking about this for 15 to 20 years. You start talking to people now who work in kind of mainstream bioethics, or in kind of social and political philosophy. They're becoming increasingly aware of these topics, how important they are. I was talking to Millie Solomon, who's the president of the Hastings Center in New York. It's the first bioethics institute ever founded in the United States, and she was very, very aware of these issues, right? Maybe in the way that she would not have been a decade ago. In terms of books, I recommend Michael Sandel, who wrote a book called The Case Against Perfection. He's a great teacher. He teaches this famous class at Harvard called Justice, where like 1,000 students are looking into the windows, things like that, right? I mean, it's the most famous class at Harvard. You can watch it online as well. And his book, The Case Against Perfection, is very good. Francis Fukuyama has a book as well called Our Post-Human Future that I recommend. It's some of the science is a little bit dated, but it is still philosophically is very rich. The President's Council on Bioethics, when Dr. Cass was the chairman, put out a whole series of reports. They're very good. There's a report on cloning. There's a very good report called Beyond Therapy. You can go online, you can read it. It's available. It's a PDF. It's on a U.S. government website. So Beyond Therapy report is very good. If you're looking for people that are defending IgM, Jordan Savulescu would be a name that comes to mind. Alan Buchanan, Nick Bostrom from Oxford, the Future of Humanity Institute there. So this debate is really raging. Right? I try to kind of lay out all sides here.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Anybody else? Are we excited about this? Are we terrified? I mentioned one of the technologies, EEG technology is coming. I was talking to a scholar at Duke Law School named Nita Farahani. She's doing really important work on this. And so Apple right now is embedding EEG technology into all their products. We have AirPods, Apple, iWatch, iPhone, desktops, laptops. They're embedding electric encephalogram technology that will allow for us. So what they do is people go into a room, they listen to podcasts, they record brain activity, and there's an AI program that is able to translate that brain activity into language and images. So we may see the possibility of mind reading here in the near future. The researchers for Meta for Facebook were terrified by this, how accurate it was. It was about 80% accurate. This does not require you to go into an fMRI machine. Okay, so I could be standing here and I could read your minds in the back of the room with a pretty high level of accuracy. You could read mine. Okay, is that exciting? Is that terrifying? Is there a right to mental privacy? This is a really important question. Do we need to enshrine this in law? Okay, because Apple, Facebook, big tech is embedding this technology in all of their products. Okay. And they're trying to frame this as, okay, we can help people with ALS, locked-in syndrome, people who have strokes. They might be able to communicate. That's wonderful, sure. But obviously the rest of us, we're able to communicate, right? And people say, well, we're very clumsy output. Our hands are very clumsy output devices. And if you could just sit down at your laptop and just type by thinking or surf the web by thinking, well, that's much better. We can read each other's thoughts, right? Okay.
Exam taking is going to be much easier.
Exam typing, right? Yeah, okay. Wow. How would that affect your relationships? You could read each other's minds. Is that going to draw you closer together? Is that going to put a strain on those relationships and destroy relationships? Should this technology be available? The criminal justice system, right? There's a great movie called Minority Report based on a Philip K. Dick novel, right? Where they arrest people for crimes they've not yet committed, but based on thought crimes. In 1984 by Orwell, right? Even, in that case, even if he's being tortured by Big Brother, he can still retreat within himself. He has this sort of sphere of mental privacy. Well, this could very quickly go in an authoritarian direction very quickly. I think that the possibility of abuse is very, very high. Like NSA right now is listening to all our emails, all our phone calls, right? Well, they're listening to our thoughts relatively soon. Okay, this is really important. This is going to have major implications for all of us. Even the researchers about these technologies saying, hey, I don't know if we should have this power. Yeah.
Honestly, right now it seems like you have these two sorts of new technologies, of biotechnology and also artificial intelligence, that seem like Manhattan Project level of moral difficulty associated with these things. Have you done much work like looking at the overlap between those two and what could happen? Like if both just take off and at the same time it's, like I said, it hits us and all we can do is take it.
Yeah, Elon Musk is really interested, like Neuralink, for instance. He thinks our only hope to keep up AI is to have undergo genetic enhancement and to have to use these technologies, right, to really kind of keep up, right? So he sees a kind of fusion taking place in the next generation or so, so that we're not rendered irrelevant or superfluous, right? So yeah, AI is being used a lot in healthcare now for medical diagnosis. I know somebody's actually writing the code, the algorithms for Watson, medical diagnosis system developed by IBM, right? They're far more accurate than the very best radiologists. I would be careful about going into radiology. Going to radiology, I'd be careful about that because, human radiologists may not exist for much longer. Okay? It's going to have a major impact on our economies. I think we're probably going to see, we may go in the direction of UBI, universal basic income, as more and more people are put out of work. It's going to really affect our economies. Question, what do we do with all that free time? Are we going to write poetry and are we going to, take soma, something like that? That's something like soma is probably coming as well. A kind of super Prozac that gives you a kind of dopamine high. The question is, should you take that drug? Right? Should you try to feel good all the time? Or rather, should you seek to have the appropriate feelings, have the right feelings in the right way at the right time? And somebody really close to you dies, so that's somebody you love. So there's a time to grieve, right? There's a time for joy as well, right? But what matters is having the right feelings in the right way at the right time. Aristotle's very definition of virtue. That's, feelings play a crucial role in this kind of virtue. Feeling appropriately, right? It requires practical wisdom, right? Kinesis. Other questions? Anybody else?
Oh,
Yes.
I have a question. Thank you. I think the world that you are describing is pretty scary to me.
There's a lot of people, when they hear this, say, wow, I don't know if I want to live in this world. Yeah.
I don't know, but one of the things, and there is a lot that you present and a lot to think about. When you have these questions listed here and you say, should we embrace the project of IGM? Is there a moral imperative to do so? So the we, Who is it? Because it seems that, as you have pointed out, that it has become so speeding up. We have a hard time keeping up with it.
Yeah.
The average person who has little to no knowledge about all of that.
Yeah.
Who is making the decision?
Great question.
It seems like experts who have that knowledge.
Yeah.
But that then narrows down really the pool
That's
of,
right.
and do we trust these people? There are all kinds of series of concerns.
That's a great question. Yeah, I'm very concerned about that. So I'm a huge fan of deliberative democracy. Deliberative democracy, right? So it's crucial these decisions are not made by a small group of people at Davos or in some back room somewhere,
Exactly.
at large corporations. It's crucial that all of us are involved in this conversation. That's the reason why I do this work, right? I see all these force multipliers, right? So you go out and share what you've learned with others. I tell my students this. Share what you've learned with others, with your parents, with your friends, with your fellow citizens, your neighbors, because it's crucial, because the biotech revolution is have a dramatic impact on all of our lives. So it's crucial that everybody's involved in this conversation, all stakeholders, all constituencies, all groups. And these decisions are not made by a small number of people in some back room somewhere. Okay, very important. How do we get to that point? That's Danielle Allen is very worried about that. Jennifer Doudna is very worried about that. And she's the co-discoverer of CRISPR-Cas9, right?
Yeah.
She's very worried about a loss of genetic diversity as well. That's a real concern of hers as well.
We would all very much like smart people, but do I want to interact with these very smart people?
Yeah, that's right. And the fashion trends, other biological trends, where people want to look a certain way. And, engineer yourself to look like some celebrity, right? Okay. Any other thoughts, any other questions?
What kind of further education would you recommend for philosophy or less medical side people for this kind of stuff?
Yeah, I would take a bioethics course, and some of you guys offer, Dr. Smiley teaching bioethics, right? So you take his class, right? I teach a class at Harvard that it's open to the public. I've recorded my class as well. You can a massive open online course. I offer my course at Harvard Extension School as well. You can take my class. Ethics and Trends in Biotechnology, teaching the course Biotechnology and Human Good. Glenn Cohen has a good course on this as well. I don't agree with him about everything, but he does serious work. So yeah, there's more and more work out there. I would try to take a bioethics course, inform yourself, read, check out the Wall Street Journal series I recommended. Read Sandel, read Fukuyama, read reports put out by the President's Council on Bioethics. Yeah, these are just crucial questions. Yeah, you can do a lot of master's programs in bioethics now. You're seeing these kind of spring out into the master's program in bioethics. Because I think people recognize, a lot of physicians, a lot of medical science, a lot of people going into these programs are physicians and biomedical researchers who recognize how important these ethical questions are. They're very troubled by aspects of their work or their research, and they're seeing these technologies develop, and they're saying, this is really important. We need to be thinking about this very carefully. Yes.
Do you think the playing God critique could go beyond just judging who gets to live or not, but maybe it's just recognize that God knows better than us.
Okay, sure.
That God
Yeah,
has a design,
sure.
and while we don't understand why our bodies are designed like this, there's a greater purpose.
Sure. Yeah, I'm very open to theological voices in bioethics, absolutely. Some people will make those arguments, right, that this is their divine prerogative. This is not going to turn out well. Even people that defend just Darwinian natural selection might say, well, natural selection is like a master engineer, and organisms are just perfectly adapted to their environments over this very long period of time. And who are we to tamper with this, right? It's going to turn out disastrously, right? So you'll sometimes hear that type of argument from people just defending the Darwinian account, right? A kind of perfect adaptation. But yeah, sure, you could frame this theologically, sure. I'm totally in favor of having theological voices in contemporary bioethical debates. But those are important voices. Interesting, in the 1970s, there was an attempt to really expel. Obviously, bioethics really developed as a discipline in the 1960s. And you look at the Catholic Church, this is obviously Catholic school. The Catholic Church has a very, very rich tradition of moral theology and what we now call bioethics, medical ethics, going back centuries. So it's not surprising. You look at the history of bioethics, a lot of people involved early on in the 1960s, 1970s, the moral theologians, people like Paul Ramsey, Richard McCormick, right? And did really important work in bioethics. In the 1970s, there wasn't a kind of attempt to expel them from the field by kind of more secular analytic moral philosophers. I think that was a mistake. There's a sociologist at Wellesley College wrote an entire book about this. And he argues the current crisis in medicine, the crisis in trust, I would say, is partly related to that very series of events. Yeah.
Okay, so like the goal of IGM is to create a painless, suffering-free, and finally immortal.
That's one interpretation. Yeah.
Sure, sure.
Yeah.
So like, for the other side, like what would their goal of life be? I guess, what are their main values?
Okay.
That's what I think so.
So those that might have concerns about the process.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, this goes deep, right? It really forces you to think about the human good. Right? I think there's a tendency today to simply reduce these debates to reduce the human good to just optimal biological health. Right? I would say, yes, in Aristotle. So you read Aristotle's Ethics, right? He says, yeah, you need a certain amount of good health in order to be eudaimon. Right? To be happy. If you're in a vegetative state, PVS state, we can't call you eudaimon. We can't call you happy. Why? Because happiness usually has an activity. It's not a state or a condition. And for him, that involves the exercise of the virtues over a complete lifetime. That's Aristotle's conception of human happiness, right? You acquire these key moral and intellectual virtues. For him, that's the ultimate measure of human life. Are you courageous? Are you kind? Are you generous? Are you honest? Are you empathetic? That's the measure of human life for Aristotle. You have these key moral and intellectual virtues. Okay? So I have a concern here that there's a tendency at times just to say, well, the human good solely is optimal biological health, like being like an Olympic athlete. I would say there's a lot more to human good. There are a lot of healthy Nazis, right? They're very healthy, right? But, there was, it's a very thin and impoverished conception of the human good, I would say. Any thoughts, any questions? Okay. Well, thank you, I really appreciate your time and I'll let you know. Morning, everyone. Great round of talk. Thank you again, Dr. Furlan.
Yes.
I know.
Welcome.